All right, so I want to cover the topic of cutters versus sinkers because every once in a while in a lesson, I'll get a kid who says, "Yeah, my coach has been teaching me a sinker or a sinker, blah blah blah." Great, sinkers, two seamers, often interchangeable, great pitches. I'll talk about them in a second, but then they'll also sometimes I'll get lessons pitchers who say, "My coach wants me to throw a cutter," and there's a 14-year-old kid. And I say, no, that's a extremely poor decision. It's not appropriate pitch for you, and here's why. So number one, let's talk about the sinker slash two-seamer. So when you throw a sinker or two-seamer, so baseball, two-seamer, right? Still a two-seamer. The standard is you have your fingers pretty close together, and if you have a lower arm slot, it's just going to come out tilted, and this two-seam just tends to make it do that a little bit. Now, when you want to start to add more, you start to tilt the ball a little bit. You just tend to tinker kind of with like a one-seam grip, but our goal is to kind of get the ball to come off that way. We're imposing a little bit of angled spin to the ball. So there's a lot of different ways to tinker with a two-seamer, but basically they're interchangeable terms. A two-seamer is a two-seamer when it just sort of has a run. When it goes to your arm side, doesn't have a lot of sink. When you throw a two-seamer and it sinks a lot, in addition to having run, it becomes a quote-unquote sinker. You could throw a two-seamer with this grip, or you could also throw the world's dirtiest sinker with this grip. I keep hitting my mic. They're both the same pitch. They just become one or the other by name based on the action. So two-seamer, sinker, same pitch, but if yours doesn't sink, it's not a sinker. If it does sink, it is a sinker. If it only runs, it's just a two-seamer. It's kind of how it works. Now, when you fork your fingers too wide, you tend to put a little more pressure sometimes with your middle finger, and now it cuts, and that's not what we want. Now we have just a sloppily cutting, just whatever pitch that's slower than our four-seamer, has no rise, hump to it, none of that stuff. Fastballs can't actually rise, but they appear to. You basically lose all the benefits of a four-seamer and all the benefits of a two-seamer or sinker if our fingers are forked too wide and we start to put undue pressure on the middle finger and make it cut by accident. So if you are going to throw a two-seamer or sinker, these fingers need to be pretty close together and slightly overloaded in the middle of the ball so we can get on the inside to make that ball sink and run. So for young pitchers, and for me this is under 14 usually, and it can vary, it can depend, so it's not absolute, but if you're 14 or below, just throw a four-seamer. You don't need to accidentally be cutting your two-seamer, which often happens, way more than you'd think, to be honest with you. Most kids' two-seamers won't actually move, so then they're just a crappy version of a four-seamer. Four-seamer is going to have the best life to it, the best velocity, and the most locatability because it's going to be straight. So look, I understand that if you could throw two fastballs at the same speed and one moves and the other one doesn't, the one that moves is better. I get it. However, most kids can't throw strikes when they're in amateur baseball. Even high school kids can't throw strikes hardly. So we need to have a pitch that we're really concerned about cutting and running it when we're still walking 4 batters per 9 innings. I would rather you throw more strikes in general and learn to command the zone and learn to work the ball in and out, up when you need to punch out, down with an off-speed pitch when you need to strike out as well, then work on throwing tons of two-seamers and cutters. And when you don't throw super hard, so when you are 14 or below and you're throwing below 70 miles per hour, your two-seamer is not going to run that much. It'll run a little bit, but not a ton. But it's often going to run out of the zone, and then when young pitchers start missing with balls, they tend to get nervous and they throw more balls, and it just spirals out of control a lot of times. I just in general think, and you're more than welcome to disagree with me, that when you're below 14, just throw four-seamers, throw the shit out of them, and learn to locate. That's fine. If you then can do those things, and I see that you maybe have a lower arm slot and you can locate a little bit, I'll teach you a sinker happily. Let's throw some sinkers to the arm side, away to righties if you're a righty, and let's jam some righties, away to lefties, and let's jam some righties. So I kind of will introduce it when I see a kid who can already locate really well and has the ability to potentially get some sink and some run. Sure, I'll teach them that pitch. But in general, it's just not the right pitch below 14 years old for most players. So that's where I'm at with the sinker slash two seamer. With the cutter is wildly inappropriate for a number of reasons. Number one, the cutter was the hardest pitch I'd ever learned to throw. I threw a cutter for 2 seasons in 2014 and 2015. 2016, I kind of scrapped it because I didn't really need it. 2014, 2015, I desperately needed my cutter because I just couldn't find the feel for my breaking ball and my changeup after Tommy John surgery. For whatever reason, I just really struggled to throw my changeup and my curveball for strikes at the level that I had to throw it. So I recovered from my second surgery, and I was plugged into the Atlantic League, which is an extremely high level of baseball. It's the highest level of independent baseball, and that's where almost all former major leaguers, AAA and AA players play when they've just been released and want to keep going and try to get another shot, try to get recirculated. So that's where like Scott Kazmir, Rich Hill, Dontrell Willis, a lot of these guys, big names, have played in the Atlantic League and sometimes get roughed up in the Atlantic League. It's a good, strong league. So I got thrown in there after not throwing a competitive pitch for 2 years, and I was doing okay, but just throwing fastballs didn't work very long. So I needed another pitch, and not being able to throw my changeup and curveball was not a good scenario because those guys could whip a fastball pretty easy. So I started throwing a cutter. I had a couple different guys teach me it. It's basically just like if you throw a four-seamer, now it's a cutter. If you throw, I don't like holding the horseshoe, but I don't hold the horseshoe this way. This feels uncomfortable to me, but four-seamer, cutter. That's it. It's just a little bit overloaded, and our goal is that when it leaves my fingertips, it's going to be tilted slightly. So instead of me being right through the middle of it, it's going to be, boom, just slightly tilted. But so slightly that it's basically a fastball until the last little bit, and then it veers off and takes a little jagged turn at the very end. So basically the difference between cutters and sinkers in their utility, you'd think that they have the same utility, and they kind of do it in pro baseball. So in pro baseball, for guys like me who are four-seamer guys with high spin rates, I couldn't make a ball sink to save my life. Tried it only when I threw from a little lower arm slot when I was in my college years for like a year, and like one of my pro years where I threw from a slightly lower arm slot, I could actually get some decent sink. I had a good four-seamer. I could throw it by guys. They'd pop it up. Like, it was a good pitch for me. The cutter made sense as a way for me to get the ball into lefties. It was my fourth pitch. So it was not it was initially my second pitch, but when I had my whole repertoire back after surgery, when I could throw my fastball, curveball, changeup for strikes, my cutter became a very purposeful pitch, which was to jam left-handed hitters. That was it. And I could throw it when I was behind the count to right-handed hitters to get them to put the ball on the ground. Because I was a high spin rate guy, I could not get ground balls very easily. I once went 10 straight innings without getting one single ground ball out. That's a lot of fly balls. It's a lot of fly balls and strikeouts. So for me, the cutter had utility, jamming lefties, getting ground balls, and a pitch that they wouldn't necessarily barrel up if I threw it behind in the count. That was it. So it was a true fourth pitch, a very small niche utility for me. Now, the difference between cutters and sinkers, and this is the way to really think about it, is that a sinker, as you get better at throwing it, the movement increases to a point. It increases. So you see guys in the big leagues that throw really good sinkers, they go, like they move a lot. It still looks kind of jagged to a hitter because they throw them so hard, but they move a lot. And when you don't throw as hard when you're a young pitcher, amateur pitcher, and you only throw 60, 70, 80, you're not going to get nearly as much movement out of it because the ball it's not as fast of a pitch. The faster it's thrown, the more the movement's going to start to come in, and the more jagged that movement will appear to a hitter. So when you get better at the sinker, the movement gets bigger and the movement gets more pronounced. When you're a cutter, it's the exact opposite. Most players that I see who are amateurs who say, I throw a cutter, 13-year-old kid. Okay, it's a crappy slider. It's not a cutter. Because the cutter is super, and the reason this was the reason it was super hard to learn, when I was trying to throw a cutter, I had to throw it in pregame, and when I was playing catch, as a reliever, I had to throw it in pregame playing catch to see, to learn the pitch, so then I could take it out on the field. I'm not just going to, try to learn a new pitch in the game. And I'd throw it to guys who'd thrown it before, and they would give me feedback, oh, yeah, that spin looks good, that one looks bad, no, that one was bad. And I couldn't see any of them, not one of them move at all. And they would just give me feedback based on the spin. And they're like, yeah, it won't move. You won't be able to see the cutter move until you're on a game mound throwing basically full speed. I was like, oh, great. So when you get no visual feedback at all as a pitcher on a new pitch, it's extremely hard to have any idea if you're throwing it correctly. Without my teammates who'd thrown cutters for a long time, I would have had zero chance of figuring out what it was supposed to be, because what I wanted to do was make it slide. And when I could see the thing break playing catch, I was like, oh, that one was good, wasn't it? They're like, no, that was way too big. That was a slider. I was like, oh. They're like, a cutter is not a slider. A slider is a slider. Slider will break, this much. A cutter breaks this much. So it breaks more the harder you throw it, but it breaks sharper the harder you throw it. So it'll stay on the fastball's path until the very end and then just take that little jagged turn. That's how it breaks guys' bats. That's why they just, their brain can't figure it out. So when we do that, the better we get with the cutter, the smaller the movement gets. So when you're a young kid throwing a cutter, you're going to make it a slider. And it's almost impossible for you to actually make a cut throwing it as slow as you do. So it's not going to be a pitch. Basically, if your coach wants you to throw a cutter, he's basically just saying, I want you to throw a slider. And maybe that's okay for you, but don't call it a cutter. So, and lastly, the cutter is not a second pitch. It's not a pitch that you're going to develop for the rest of your life. So at 13 or 14 or 15 years old, you should be learning to command your fastball still, to command a changeup for sure, and then to command one traditional breaking ball, which either means the slider or the curveball. One of those two for you. So where does the cutter fit in? Again, for me, I threw it to lefties, and when I was behind the count, it had a very specific purpose. But to get a strikeout, it was curveball, changeup, or fastball. To get a ground ball, it was a changeup. To get a my traditional breaking balls were the ones that I've been throwing my whole life that I relied on to change speeds. The cutter's also not a speed change pitch. It's basically the same speed as your fastball. When I was throwing 91 to 94, my cutter was 87 to 90, something like that. So that was not really a speed change. So that's why I still need another pitch, because throwing only fastballs and cutters, unless you're just a legend like Kenley Jansen or one of those guys, or Mariano Rivera, you can't get by not having a speed change. So the cutter just doesn't have a place in an amateur pitcher's arsenal. Now, I understand amateur could mean high Division I baseball, but really just like the lower college and below level. If you're throwing 90 miles per hour, throw a cutter. It's completely fine. But for almost everyone else, it just doesn't fit. You need to spend most of your time with the fastball, developing your changeup, developing your curveball or slider, the three pitches that will be with you the rest of your career. The cutter just isn't going to be there. It's not going to have utility until you're extremely good. Because when are you going to throw a cutter when you're young? Just throw the curveball, throw the slider, throw the changeup. They'll do the job that you want it to do. And if you're just trying to get ground balls and get a pitch to move off their barrel, the cutter's not the pitch for that, because it's going to be too big when you're young, because you will throw it like a slider essentially. So they're kind of on the opposite spectrum, where they're the sinker. When you get better at it, the sinking action increases and gets more effective. The cutter, as you get better at it, the cutting action gets smaller and later and more jagged. And it's just so hard to learn that pitch. I just cannot tell you how difficult it was to throw a good cutter. I never fully mastered it. I threw some good ones, and they're exciting when you throw them well. I threw one to a lefty where it was coming in. He committed to swing, and then it broke. And it was a little bigger one than I normally throw. And I literally heard him go, oh, shit, as he swung. Because it just, at the last minute, took a turn that he, couldn't comprehend. His brain just, didn't get it. And he's like, oh, crap. What's about to happen here? So it was a fun pitch to throw. But even then, the more I could command my fastball, changeup, and curveball for strikes, the less the cutter became all that relevant of a pitch for me. So, again, if you're a big leaguer, pro guy, and you can already throw 3 great pitches for strikes, and you're just on the way up, by all means, add a cutter. But if you're an amateur pitcher, you have so much more to worry about. You have so much longer to go, and that's such a difficult niche pitch. It's not the one for you.